6'7", there's barely a podium on earth that's equipped to facilitate my height. So yeah, thank you, Sue, for that introduction. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me to speak here today. The talk that I'm giving is called Concerning Violence Revisited. But first I would like to, before I begin my reflections on the violence of our settler colonial present, I would like to start with a statement, again, of gratitude, not only to the organizers, but particularly to the hosts of the 2016 Historical Materialism Gathering, namely the nation of the Mississauga Anishinaabe. Toronto is an area rich in the theory and practice of Indigenous political alliance, holding the histories and the presence of not only the Mississauga, but also the Wendat and Haudenosaunee Confederacy. These nations negotiated and continue to practice diplomatic relationships with each other to share the land while respecting each other's governance, their jurisdiction, and their sovereignty. Each nation also exists in a deep reciprocal relationship with the land, the Great Lakes, and in particular Lake Ontario, and the waterways that flow from it. These nations foster deep relations to the St. Lawrence River, leading to the Atlantic Ocean, the diverse plant and animal species within the territories, the thunderers and the rains, and all the physical and spiritual forces that connect them to this place of creation in an intimate and meaningful way. To many Indigenous academics and organizers at these types of events, the lands and the sovereignties of Indigenous peoples rarely figure much into the conference proceedings, at least beyond a symbolic opening gesture. This form of erasure, the erasure of Indigenous bodies, lands, and jurisdictions, is one of the core violences that constitute Indigenous peoples' experiences of our settler colonial present, both inside and outside of the Academy. The structured erasure of Mississauga, Anishinaabe, Wendat, and Haudenosaunee sovereignty from these spaces is not only a reinforcement of our settler colonial present, but it is a negation of the contributions of their presence in this place, a presence that has been violently attacked in the name of dispossession for over 4 centuries now. It is a negation of their intellectual and political practices of governing in solidarity that we are at odds and at our own peril ignore. This acknowledgement then necessitates a different beginning, one in which we actively take on the contestation of settler colonization in all of its violent dimensions as a point of departure, so that when our work on solidarity against the violences of capital, we are not standing on the backs of Indigenous peoples, but are instead engaged as related comrades, joined in critical co-resistance against the convergence of forces that divide and conquer us. And not only us, but the land upon which we all depend. So in my own work, I interrogate capital in a manner that I hopefully foregrounds this settler colonial frame, within which its diverse configurations of power converge to produce a host of violences, from environmental degradation and white supremacy, to heteropatriarchal domination, to class exploitation and inequality. I conceptualize the settler colonization as a structure of domination that is in part predicated on the ongoing dispossession of Indigenous peoples of our lands and the forms of political authority and jurisdiction that govern our relationships between each other, between us and you, and between the land itself. In doing so, I've drawn in my own work significantly from a number of theoretical resources, 2 of which are particularly relevant to this conference's proceedings. That being Karl Marx's writings on the primitive accumulation of capital, and Frantz Fanon's critique of Hegel's master-slave parable when applied to colonial situations here. The violence that Indigenous peoples face is both systemic and symbolic. It is systemic in the sense that it has been structured, indeed institutionalized, into a relatively secure and resistant set of social relationships, material relations that render Indigenous communities more likely than their non-Indigenous counterparts to suffer severe economic and social privation. Just as importantly, however, the violence that we also face is symbolic in the sense that Fanon and later Baru would come to stress, namely gentle and visible violence, unrecognizable as such, chosen as much as it is undone. Symbolic violence, in other words, is the ideological form of violence and forms of violent social conditioning that render the crushing materiality of systemic violence invisible, appear natural, and therefore acceptable. Now, at least two critiques of my own representation of settler colonial violence have come to the fore in the last couple of years and have forced me to modify my position on these, particularly as I take it up in red skin, white masks. First, my good friend and colleague Sarah Hunt at the University of British Columbia recognizes that while I try to make Indigenous feminist analyses foundation to my approach in red skin, it is important that I remain attentive to the ways in which an unmodified colonial violence still serves to significantly structure our lives, not only in a symbolic manner at the macro Indigenous state relation level, but also in a very literal way at the micro or intimate sphere of our everyday relationships. This is a crucial provocation, for it suggests against certain interpretations of mine and other people's work that hard violence continues to play a core function in the colonial relationship as such, one that hasn't been entirely superseded by the softer violence that is largely mediated through the colonial politics of recognition that I have spent most of my time examining in my own work. And why is it that an approach that owes so much to my Indigenous feminist comrades ought to have been more attentive to this? Simply because the hard violence that remains central to the colonial relationship is distributed in radically asymmetrical ways across Indigenous bodies according to sex, gender, and sexual orientation. The effects of this violence are all too clear. The premature death and disappearance of some of our community members in numbers greatly, or much greater than those of others. And while this colonial gender violence is clearly sanctioned structurally through state neglect and perpetration, much of it is played out at the macro level of bodies and interpersonal relationships in ways that render its political character difficult to see, if not detect. Now, the repercussions of this intervention for research in anti-colonial politics are significant. Imagine if we, and I'm quoting here, imagine if we had not lost the capacity to determine and enforce jurisdictional power over our homelands and our bodies, asked Sarah Hunt. In such a context, there would be, quote, no macro-micro political division. Our consciousness as legal and political actors would be formed both by looking inward towards the intimate spaces of our homes and communities, as well as outward towards the engagement with the systems of settler colonial power. I take this critique to be decisive and now see that in retrospect, I should have taken more time and space in my own work to focus, as Hunt suggests, on the micro scale of violences that asymmetrically affect our lives as Indigenous peoples and our status and bodies, and the status and bodies of Indigenous women, girls, and GBLTQ2S folks, as not only an opening gesture or closing gesture story, but rather as foundation to my overall theoretical framework. The second critique has emerged more or less online and in bits and pieces through subliminal tweets and Facebook posts, and concerns my use of Fanon in my own work, or perhaps even my misuse of Fanon and his relationship to the Black radical tradition, and how my failure to discuss this relationship amounts to a violence or erasure of its own. For Coulthard, writes Jared Sexton, Fanon is right that the politics of recognition is a dead end, yet he is nonetheless ultimately mistaken, and he's quoting me now, regarding violence being the perfect mediation through which colonists come to liberate themselves from both the structural and psychoaffective features of colonial domination. Black thought, he concludes, is in this way can inform and inspire, but in no way should it orient Indigenous people's politics. Now, as a theorist and revolutionary that stressed self-emancipation grounded on the values and practices of the colonized themselves and their specificity, I'm not convinced by Sexton's suggestion that Indigenous politics should be oriented around, solely around the contributions of Fanon. I would nonetheless like to accept his invitation to speak more to the international realm of Indigenous people's struggle and its crucial relationship to the literary context of Black power and of the third world decolonization movements that precede us. Both because it links back to my own use of Fanon and his work, but also because it's quite simply a very interesting story to tell. A story about the applicability of using disparate theoretical traditions across time and space, and about how the necessity is necessary for us of thinking in solidarity with us, especially all of those colonized and enslaved peoples here and abroad. Now, when I first began to conduct research on the Dene Nation struggle for self-determination over a decade ago, it became immediately clear to me that our leaders saw our decolonization efforts as necessarily linked to the struggles of colonized peoples elsewhere, both domestically and internationally. Indeed, the Dene Nation was explicit about these connections. Consider the following statement written in the first draft of the Dene Declaration of 1975, where it states unequivocally that there are many, quote, lessons for the Dene to learn from the development of third world countries. As colonies of the imperial powers, they everywhere failed to develop. Their prospects necessarily improved to the extent that they were successful in gaining independence. But even after formal political independence, many have had the trouble developing because of the power of the so-called multinational corporations, with their base in a small number of highly developed industrial societies, and how this has denied economic independence. Only with tremendous effort from the people can an economy independent of the outside control, or independent from outside control, be built. Our situation in the North is the same as that of the peoples of the Third World, who were only until recently subjugated. Now, the draft of the Declaration ends with two appendices, one including a declaration on development, quote, proposing an alternative mixed economy, privileging a contemporary bush mode of production on the one hand, and in cases when the nation forays into industrial activity, worker-controlled, owned, and operated enterprises, and a ban on private property on the other. In other documents, this proposed economy is posited as more in sync with the collective orientation of Dene culture and values. The second appendix is about strategy and includes recognition that the Dene face enemies both from without and within. The latter as a result of the internalized colonialism that has caused us to turn against our own. Now, I just recently came across this draft of the Declaration, and when I looked through it through a contemporary lens, it made sense to me. Quote, formal independence occurring simultaneously with economic subjugation. Enemies from within and from without. All of these concepts were drawn from third world theorizing from the likes of people like Albert Memmi, Kwame Nkrumah, and of course Frantz Fanon. In turning to these theorists, we were not, as critics of the day suggested, being brainwashed by our left-wing white consultants. We were critically engaging in a global anti-imperialist conversation that had well-established roots among radicals of all stripes in Canada during the 1960s and 70s. Fanon in particular was a central figure in these conversations. Fanon's impact in North America, especially in the United States, has been well noted by scholars like Homi Bhabha and Stuart Hall. In particular, Fanon's writings on colonial racism and national liberation indelibly shaped the more militant arm of the civil rights movements, the Black Power movement, the Red Power movement in the 1960s. One can read both explicit and implicit traces of Fanon's thought, for example, in the writings of Dennis Banks of the American Indian movement, of the great militant Malcolm X and Huey Newton, Bobby Seale of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, and in the writings of ex-Panther Eldridge Cleaver, who was once famously, I think, misquoted here, as saying that in the heyday of the Black Power movement, every brother on a rooftop could quote Fanon. The profound mark that Fanon left on 1960s and 70s anti-colonial radicalism led Stuart Hall famously to state that Wretched Earth was nothing more than the Bible of decolonization. Interesting, however, Fanon's influence is perhaps even more pronounced, although decidedly less talked about in Canada. For instance, in the 1960s, Quebec sovereigntists often borrowed the language of Fanonian anti-colonialism in their struggles for national liberation, while largely ignoring Fanon's insights into the problem of recognition in colonial contexts, and as Quebec's problematic status as a white settler society actively complicit in the violent dispossession of Indigenous peoples in that province. Fanon's influence on Quebec nationalism was particularly evident in the writings of Pierre Valliere, especially his infamously titled book, White Niggers of America, which he wrote from prison and published in 1968. While Valliere doesn't discuss Fanon explicitly, he nonetheless refers in his introduction to himself as one of the wretched of the earth, providing testament to the subtle influence of Fanon's work in relationship to Quebec's contradictory standing as both colonizer and colonized. Indeed, to many within the Quebec sovereignty movement, in the 1960s at least, Valliere was considered an intellectual hero of the Front de Libération du Québec, or FLQ, the armed faction of the Quebec separatist movement, although he eventually distanced himself from the organization after its high-profile abduction and murder of Quebec Vice Premier Pierre Laporte in 1970. The point to note here, as David Austin reminds us in his wonderful book, is that, quote, while anti-colonial ideas found fertile ground in Montreal, none took root as firmly as those of Fanon. The questionable appropriation of Fanonian insights applied to the Canadian context didn't stop with the Quebec separatists, however. Indeed, none other than our Prime Minister himself, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, invokes Fanon's Wretched of the Earth in a 1964 article that challenges the independence claims of Quebecois on the grounds that they theoretically defend these claims by cherry-picking Fanon's views on violence while ignoring his critique of the national bourgeoisie. So sorry not to laugh at this. He writes, and I quote, some of the counter-revolutionaries deceive themselves by dressing up in a Marxist-Leninist disguise, as has already been done by those African chieftains whom, indeed, they take as their models. But all this masquerade has been admirably described by Frantz Fanon in The Wretched of the Earth, which nonetheless our counter-revolutionaries say is the book that they keep by their bedsides. This makes me think that they read no more in bed than they do elsewhere. So I shall do them a favor and quote at length from Fanon's text published in 1961, and of which they have perhaps only leafed through the first chapter on violence. Blah, 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 blah. Given that Trudeau's theoretical use of Fanon is used to defend the territorial integrity of a colonial state founded on genocide, I think that we can safely presume that Fanon would be rolling in his grave regarding the interjection of his work into this largely white colonial melodrama that constituted the back-and-forth bickering between Canadian federalists like Trudeau and Quebec sovereigntists like Dallaire. More on the mark, however, has been Fanon's stamp on the intellectual input of Indigenous scholars and activists in Canada. Out of all Red Power voices, Fanon's influence was most influential in the work of the late Métis historian Howard Adams. According to Adams' own account, he was first introduced to the literature of the Black Power movement, particularly Malcolm X and Cleaver, and the writings of Third World anti-colonialists like Nkrumah, Beni, and Fanon, while a graduate student at Berkeley during the turbulent decade of 1960s student radicalism. This experience would significantly shape the theoretical and historical analyses Adams develops in his two major political works. His 1975 text, Prison of Grass, Canada from a Native Point of View, and his 1995 follow-up, A Tortured People, The Politics of Colonization. In both of these texts, Adams applies Fanon's insights into the nature of internalized violence to show how colonialism is able to secure its dominance over native lands and bodies by warping the behavior and self-image of colonized subjects in ways that make our dispossession and political subjugation appear as an appropriate response to our perceived cultural inferiority or backwardness. Now, if the influence of so-called Third World theory arrived in 1960s Montreal via Fanon and Martinique, and onto the Canadian prairies via Howard Adams and Berkeley, I suggest that it arrived in the North with my people through the Dene Nation's working relationship with the great Shuswap leader George Manuel. There's ample evidence to support this claim. First, Manuel is a strong supporter of the Dene Nation's land struggle and worked closely with its leadership to promote our bid for self-determination, as demonstrated in the pages of testimony he gave in Yellowknife at the public hearings of the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline in 1976. In 1976. As stated in that testimony, Manuel saw the Dene as part of what he would come to champion as the Fourth World, a phrase that he first came across at an international gathering of diplomats from Tanzania and a number of other African countries in the late 1970s. Manuel's African ties were extensive. In 1974, he traveled to Tanzania as part of Canada's delegation of diplomats invited to attend the commemoration of Tanzania's 10-year anniversary since independence, and as the story goes, was mistaken by local politicians, including President Julius Nyerere himself, as Canada's head representative. The elite access this gave Manuel, based off of this miscommunication, enabled Manuel with the opportunity to engage in lengthy conversations with the President and other key government ministers about their respective colonial experiences and what a genuinely post-colonial form of economic and political and social development might look like, one that didn't, as Fanon insisted, take its cues from mimicking European models. As Manuel states in his